A man sits down at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning in late October with a cup of coffee and his tablet, checking his trail cameras the way he does every week. He goes through the motion events one at a time. A doe and twin fawns at the salt lick just after 10. A coyote cutting across the south end of the property around midnight. A feral hog rooting near the drainage at 3 in the morning. A pair of raccoons dismantling whatever Connie left near the garden fence. Then he opens the Moultrie camera mounted on the post at the far end of his driveway, the one aimed at the spot where the caliche gravel ends and the longleaf pine begins. A motion event at 1:47 in the morning. He opens it. What he sees in that clip is a dogman carrying its young, and then, after his brain cycles through every available explanation, it has accumulated across more than 2 decades of professional large mammal fieldwork and comes back empty. He notices something that matters more than the footage itself. He has seen this specific figure before, 13 years ago, on a stretch of US 96 3 miles south of where he is sitting right now. It looked back at him through his headlights for 6 seconds and then walked into the pine trees on 2 legs. He has been living on the edge of its territory ever since. Without knowing it, on a piece of ground it has been crossing in the dark, while he slept for at least 7 documented years. The small figure it set down on the caliche at 1:47 in the morning has been in that forest behind his house since at least a year before the footage was captured. He did not know any of it until this Sunday morning. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. The man we will call Mark asked that we not use his real name. The reasons are professional rather than personal. He spent more than 20 years working for a state wildlife agency in the East Texas region, and the contacts and credibility that career produced are still the active infrastructure of his working life in retirement. He does consulting work. He has professional relationships that depend on his being taken seriously by people in institutional positions. A name change is his only condition for this account. Everything else, the county, the forest, the specific stretch of ground where this happened, the detailed professional background that makes his observations credible, is real and verifiable, and we are presenting it as such. Only the person is protected, and only to the extent that protection is necessary. Mark owns property in Newton County, Texas. That geographic detail is where everything in this account begins, because the character of Newton County, its ecology, its scale, its relationship to the broader landscape it is embedded in, shapes every part of what follows. Newton County sits in the deep piney woods of East Texas, the region of dense lowland forest that occupies the eastern portion of the state, from the Louisiana border west across the Sabine River drainage and north through a band of territory that reaches toward the Arkansas line. The county itself is bordered on the east by the Sabine River, which is also the state boundary between Texas and Louisiana. The Sabine at Newton County is not a mountain river with dramatic rapids. It is a slow, wide, tannin-dark river, moving through a broad bottomland that the forest on both sides claims completely, a river that has functioned as a wildlife corridor between 2 state jurisdictions since long before either state existed in a legal sense. The county seat is the town of Newton, population somewhere around 2,000 people, and from Newton the landscape opens in every direction into forest. Longleaf pine on the upland ridges, loblolly and shortleaf on the mid-slope terrain, bottomland hardwoods in the creek drainages, and the deep bottomland forest of the Sabine River itself along the county's eastern edge. The Sabine National Forest covers approximately 160,000 acres in the eastern part of the county and in the Sabine and Shelby counties to the north. Newton County has a total population of roughly 14,000 people distributed across 920 square miles, outside the small communities strung along the highway corridors. Newton, Deweyville, Bleakwood, a handful of others. The landscape is structured primarily by timber production and hunting. The major timber companies hold large blocks of land in the county. The private family-held acreage has mostly passed through multiple generations without subdivision, maintained either as productive timberland or as hunting property or as both simultaneously. There are no urban areas. There are no major commercial corridors. The forest is everywhere that the roads are not, and in many portions of Newton County the roads are hours apart by foot. The piney woods of East Texas are not the kind of terrain that appears in the visual vocabulary most people associate with wilderness. There are no dramatic mountain ridgelines visible at distance, no alpine lakes, no geological landmarks that anchor the landscape in the way the big western formations anchor theirs. What the piney woods have in place of vertical drama is a horizontal density that operates differently but produces comparable concealment. The canopy on a mature longleaf or loblolly site closes in at a height that reduces midday to the light quality of late afternoon. The understory on those upland sites is relatively open where the natural fire cycle has historically maintained it, but in the creek bottoms and the bottomland hardwood areas, the water oak and willow oak and sweet gum and river birch, that gallery, the drainages feeding the Sabine, the undergrowth closes completely. Yapon holly, greenbrier, wild grape, and the lateral spread of the bottomland hardwood canopy create enclosed spaces inside the forest where a person can step 20 feet off any forest road and be completely absorbed, not hidden in the sense of active concealment, absorbed in the sense that the forest simply closes around a presence and eliminates it from visibility immediately. The terrain rolls in Newton County, but gently. The county is not flat. The upland longleaf ridges are separated from each other by the creek drainages that carry water toward the Sabine, and the transition from ridge to drainage involves meaningful topographic change over short horizontal distances. But the relief is measured in tens of feet rather than hundreds, and the overall effect is not dramatic from any single vantage point. What it produces instead is a folded landscape. Enclosed creek bottoms, invisible from the adjacent upland. Low ground that holds water year-round, in a region where the uplands dry out significantly through the summer months. Beaver pond systems that back up the smaller tributaries into marshes of several acres. These enclosed drainages are the arteries of the wildlife system in Newton County. They connect the upland forest patches and the Sabine River bottomland in a network of cover, water, and travel routes that extends across the county without major interruption. A large mammal moving along one of the creek drainage corridors in Newton County at night can travel several miles without crossing a paved road or passing near a lighted structure. The county's wildlife community reflects the productivity of that landscape, white-tailed deer in numbers that support a significant hunting economy. H.E. Newton County is in the heart of East Texas deer country, and the deer population on the private timber parcels and family holdings is substantial in most years. Feral hogs in density that rivals anywhere in North America. The East Texas piney woods have one of the most established feral hog populations in the United States, the result of a release and establishment cycle going back to the Spanish colonial period, combined with the escape of domesticated animals across generations of agricultural use. Bobcat, coyote, river otter in the bottomland drainages, alligator in the slower-moving water in the southern part of the county where the coastal plain influence begins, wild turkey in the upland timber, and, beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, black bear, the Louisiana black bear recovering under federal protections, and individuals crossing the Sabine River to re-establish in East Texas territory that was historically part of the species' range before market hunting and habitat loss eliminated them in the late 19th century.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the DOGMAN Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time, so if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
The trail camera saturation in the county is high by any national comparison. East Texas deer hunting culture is built around systematic observation of wildlife movement, and the cameras that became widely available in the early 2000s as consumer products quickly became as standard as deer feeders in the land management toolkit of Newton County landowners. A property owner running 6 to 10 cameras across 200 acres is not unusual in the county's deer hunting culture, and operations with larger acreages often run considerably more. The cumulative nighttime imagery produced by those cameras across the county at any given time is substantial. Most of it shows what anyone expects. White-tailed deer in every frame, feral hogs most nights at some camera or another, coyotes working the edges of food plots and deer feeders, raccoons around anything left in the open. Some of it does not. The Sabine National Forest, which covers the eastern portion of the county and runs up through the adjacent Sabine and Shelby counties, is a genuine large mammal ecosystem in ways that many eastern national forests are not. The forest was established from cutover and abandoned timberland in the 1920s and 30s, land that the timber companies had logged and then walked away from when the merchantable timber was gone. A century of recovery has produced mature pine stands on the uplands and a functioning bottomland hardwood system along the drainages, and the wildlife population reflects that recovery across every large mammal species the habitat can support. The forest backs up against the Sabine River on its eastern side, connecting it directly to the Louisiana forest system across the river, and that connection is the primary corridor through which the black bear recolonization has moved. The private land that borders the national forest to the west, including Mark's property, which sits on the forest boundary on its northern edge, extends that functional ecosystem onto land that federal management does not reach. The boundary between national forest and private ownership is a legal line that moves across the landscape without ecological meaning to anything that occupies the landscape. Mark grew up in the piney woods, not in Newton County but in the same broad ecosystem, in the kind of East Texas upbringing that puts a person in the forest from an early age and never really takes them out. His father worked for a timber company that held acreage in several East Texas counties and moved the family periodically with his assignments. His mother taught elementary school in the small communities they lived in. The family moved enough times during his childhood that he absorbed the piney woods as a type of landscape rather than as a specific place. The same ecosystem repeated across different county lines, the same species, the same seasonal rhythms, the same quality of light under the pine canopy across every version of the piney woods he grew up in. He was in the forest in every season from the time he was old enough to go out on his own. He knew animal tracks before he could identify them from a field guide. He knew the call of a barred owl and a red-shouldered hawk and a great horned owl, and could tell them apart at distance in the dark. He knew what a coyote smelled like in the brush when the wind was right, and what a feral hog wallow smelled like before he could see it, and what a black bear's scratch on the bark of a tree told him about when the bear had passed through. He went to Texas A&M and studied wildlife science in a program that combined rigorous fieldwork methodology with the biological and ecological theory that gives fieldwork its interpretive framework. The 2 years he spent as a field assistant for a deer management study in the hill country after graduation were valuable not for the science. The study's design was conventional enough that it added little to the existing literature. But for what he learned about working long hours in difficult terrain and producing accurate field data consistently, he came back to the piney woods in the mid-1980s and found the position at the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department that he would hold for the better part of his working life. The job title, Wildlife Biologist Technician, does not convey the scope of what the role actually involves in a region as complex and as active as the East Texas District. It is the field-level labor that produces the data the biologists analyze and the managers act on, running transects, servicing camera stations, counting animals from truck spotlights on fixed survey routes, setting and checking hair snares for DNA sampling, processing harvest data at check stations during hunting season, coordinating with landowners and county extension agents, and hunting lease operators across a multi-county area. It is the kind of work that requires continuous physical effort across terrain and weather that are frequently difficult, and it produces results that move slowly and require years of data accumulation before they support any conclusion. Mark did it for 23 years. The 3 primary programs he worked across that career tell a specific story about the East Texas large mammal community during those decades and give his account of the Newton County footage a professional context that matters. The feral hog monitoring program was his longest assignment and the one that gave him the deepest familiarity with large mammal behavior at night in the East Texas piney woods. East Texas has one of the largest and most established feral hog populations in North America. The survey methodology the department used was multimodal: spotlight counts on fixed road transects at night, camera station grids across survey units, harvest data collection from check stations and game processors, and periodic aerial surveys on the larger timber company parcels where helicopter access was available. Running the spotlight surveys meant driving forest roads and timber company access roads in the dark for 3 to 4 hours at a time, 3 or 4 nights a week during the active survey periods, counting and estimating hog groups and individual animals in the beam of the spotlight, and recording everything by location, group size, age structure, and behavioral observation. 20 years of running those surveys across a multi-county area gave Mark a comprehensive picture of where the hogs moved, when they moved, how they responded to changes in food availability and weather and hunting pressure, and how their nighttime behavior differed from their daytime behavior in ways that the daylight observer would never encounter. It also gave him a comprehensive picture of everything else that moved in the East Texas piney woods at night: because the Spotlight survey transects covered enough ground in enough conditions to show him essentially every large mammal species in the region under the full range of nighttime conditions the piney woods produce across the seasons. The black bear work came later, beginning in the late 1990s, as the Louisiana black bear recovered under Endangered Species Act protections, and the recolonization of East Texas territory became a documentable process. Texas Parks and Wildlife began monitoring the recolonization carefully, not just noting the presence of individual bears on the Texas side of the Sabine, but trying to understand the movement routes they were using, the habitat types they were selecting, and whether the East Texas landscape could support a reproducing population over the long term. Mark was part of the monitoring team, running camera stations along the Sabine River bottomland and the upland drainages adjacent to the National Forest, checking hair snares for DNA evidence of bear passage, reading the sign on forest roads and creek banks. He was on the team that documented the first confirmed reproduction of black bears in East Texas since the species had been eliminated from the state. He put a tape measure to more black bear tracks in the mud of Sabine River tributary drainages than he could count across the years he spent on that program. He knew exactly what a black bear track looked like, what a standing bear's posture looked like, what the eye-shine color of a black bear in headlights was. He knew all of this not from textbooks, but from thousands of hours of contact with the actual animals in the actual landscape. The deer monitoring program was the foundational work of the East Texas Regional Office, and the program Mark supported most consistently throughout his career. Population density estimation from camera station arrays, using the systematic camera placement and capture-recapture statistical framework that the department had refined across decades. Spotlight survey counts on fixed road transects in the fall and again in the post-rut period, providing a second density estimate that cross-checked the camera-based estimate. Antler and age structure data from harvest samples collected at check stations and processing facilities during the hunting season. The methodology required him to know the deer population in his survey counties at a level of detail that most wildlife managers never develop, because the density and distribution estimates had to be accurate enough to support harvest recommendations to the landowners and hunting lease operators whose cooperation the program depended on. He drove the deer survey transects in Newton County and the surrounding counties every 2 weeks through most of his career, at set speeds on set routes with the Spotlight and the counting protocol standardized. He knew where the deer were in every season in Newton County, from direct observation of their numbers and distribution across more than 15 years of systematic surveys. The combination of those 3 programs, nighttime feral hog surveys, black bear monitoring in the bottomland drainages, and deer population assessment across the upland and creek drainage habitat, gave Mark a comprehensive observational database of large mammal activity in the East Texas piney woods at night. He had seen every large mammal species documented in the region, under every lighting condition, in every behavioral state, at every range from 10 feet to half a mile. He had made thousands of field identifications under conditions significantly more difficult than the U.S. 96 conditions in October of 2010. His calibration for identifying large mammals in East Texas at night was as good as any calibration of that type is likely to be. He bought his Newton County property in the mid-90s. The acreage was on the market because the small cattle operation it had supported failed during the drought years of the late 80s, and the property sat vacant long enough to drop below what most buyers were looking for in Newton County. It needed fencing work, the outbuildings were in poor condition, the pasture had been grazed to bare ground in the drought years, and was growing back through an early successional phase that was mostly brush and young loblolly. The timber on the property was mixed. Middle-aged loblolly on the upland portion that had been selectively cut twice and was carrying adequate but not outstanding timber value, and a hardwood mix in the creek drainage that crossed the northern end of the acreage, mostly water oak and sweet gum, with some loblolly mixed in on the higher ground of the drainage banks. The timber value made the financial calculation work. Mark bought the property as a working rural investment and a place to hunt, not as a retirement destination. He built the house in the second year on the highest ground of the property, a broad-shouldered ridge that sat about 40 yards back from where the driveway would eventually end at the longleaf tree line, elevated just enough to give a sight line across the food plot and toward the county road. The house was built practically rather than ambitiously. A 4-room main floor, a utility room large enough to handle field equipment and game processing, a deep porch on the south side facing the cleared area, and a basement under the east end of the house that became his records room, and eventually the archive room where the bin of SD cards lived on the desk. He and Connie moved in during the spring of that second year and began the long process of turning a worn-out cattle operation into a place that reflected how they wanted to live on the land. Connie is from a timber industry family in Jasper County, one county west of Newton, and she brought to the property the practical orientation toward rural land that comes from growing up in a household that treated the forest as a working environment rather than a backdrop. She planted the kitchen garden in the first spring and has maintained it every year since, rotating the crop positions and amending the sandy East Texas soil with compost and cover crops in the way that a productive garden in the piney woods requires. The blueberry bushes along the east side of the cleared area were selected for variety across bearing seasons: early season, mid-season, and late-bearing cultivars planted together to extend the harvest window as long as possible, and they reached full production within 5 years and have produced reliably every season since. The birds compete for the fruit from the moment the earliest berries color in late spring, and Connie's annual negotiation with the bird population over the netting schedule is one of the domestic rhythms of the property that Mark refers to, with the affection of a man who has watched the same argument play out every May for 25 years. The trail cameras went on the property beginning in 2002. The first units were first-generation consumer deer cameras, the film-based models adapted from standard 35mm film cameras with infrared triggers added, requiring the photographer to pull the film canister and send it out for development before seeing any results. Mark replaced them with digital units as the technology improved, running the best available equipment at each stage, because his professional background had given him a clear understanding of what image quality cost you in terms of usable identification data. The older film cameras produced images that were useful for confirming deer presence and estimating buck antler characteristics, but were not useful for identifying individual animals by specific physical markings. The early digital units improved on that, but still produced infrared images at night that were noisy enough to obscure the detail needed for individual identification at driveway camera distances. By 2012, the driveway camera had been upgraded to a unit with significantly better infrared sensitivity, and by 2017, the Moultrie Delta was on the driveway post, with the image quality that eventually made the chest marking identification possible. He kept all the SD cards in a plastic bin in the basement office, sorted by camera and year. He cycled through the current cards every Sunday morning with coffee and added them to the bin when he was finished. He had been doing this for 21 years before the Sunday morning in October of 2023, when the 1:47 in the morning motion event at the driveway end of the property required him to stop, doing it on autopilot, and pay a fundamentally different kind of attention to what was in the frame. The feral hog spotlight surveys that Mark ran across his career were the fieldwork experience that gave him his most comprehensive picture of large mammal behavior in East Texas at night, and understanding why that is relevant requires understanding what the survey methodology actually involved. The Spotlight Survey Protocol, the department used for feral hog population estimation in the East Texas district, was built around the same basic principle as deer spotlight surveys. Drive fixed routes at set speeds with a standardized spotlight. Count every animal the beam catches. Record the group size and age structure and behavioral state at the moment of detection. Note the GPS location for each encounter, and build a density estimate from the detection rate per unit of distance traveled. In practice, the protocol was more demanding than the description suggests, because feral hogs at night in the East Texas piney woods are not the cooperative survey subjects that deer generally are. Deer caught in a spotlight typically freeze, which allows the observer time to count and characterize the group before the animals move off. Hogs often move immediately at the beam, which means the observer has a brief and sometimes fragmented view of the group as it dissolves into the brush. Counting hogs from a moving truck on a forest road at night in East Texas requires the combination of a good spotlight operator, a fast recorder, and a driver who has learned the specific timing of when to slow and when to stop based on what the spotlight is showing, all three working in coordination across 3 to 4 hours of driving per survey night. Mark drove those survey routes in Newton County and the surrounding counties 2 to 4 nights per week during the active hog survey periods, which ran in 2 intensive seasons per year. Late winter, after the vegetation had died back enough to make the hogs more visible from forest roads, and early fall before the hunting season disrupted the hog movement patterns. He drove at night in every weather condition the East Texas climate produced across those seasons. Cold front nights when the temperature dropped into the 30s, and the roadside grass was wet, and the deer stood at the road shoulder watching the truck pass. And on the humid August nights before survey season, when the temperature was still above 80 at midnight, and the moths came to the truck lights in such density that they obscured the road surface in the beam, and on the foggy December nights, when the spotlight penetrated the fog bank to about 40 yards, and the survey was close work, barely usable data, just enough to be worth recording. He saw large mammals in East Texas at night under every condition and at every range from point blank to the edge of his spotlight's effective distance, and across those years of survey driving, he built an observational baseline that was comprehensive in the specific way that only fieldwork repetition produces. Not a knowledge of typical appearances, but a knowledge of the full range of appearances, including the atypical and the unusual, so that when something outside the range appeared, it registered immediately as outside the range, rather than being accommodated into the nearest available category. The night of the US 96 encounter was not a spotlight survey night. He was driving his regular route home after servicing camera stations, not actively scanning for animals with a spotlight. The distinction matters. He had his high beams on, which provide a different and less focused illumination than the directional spotlight used in formal surveys, and the detection distance with high beams is limited in ways that the spotlight is not. The figure he detected at 77 yards in high beams was at a distance well within his reliable identification range for large mammals on a clear night. The high beams were not limiting his ability to see what was in his headlight field. What was in his headlight field simply did not fit the categories his 20 years of field observation had built. The black bear recolonization monitoring he participated in during the late 90s and 2000s involved a different and more consistent kind of fieldwork than the survey transects, because documenting the recovery of a large mammal in a landscape from which it had been eliminated required following individual animals through their movements in a way that population surveys do not. The Louisiana black bear is a subspecies recognized under the Endangered Species Act, and its recovery across the Louisiana forest ecosystems in the 1980s and 90s was the result of the federal protection the listing provided and the habitat recovery in the Atchafalaya Basin and the adjacent bottomland forest systems that gave the population room to grow. By the mid-90s, the Louisiana populations were large enough that individuals were dispersing across ranges that extended to the Sabine River, and the first documented crossings into Texas produced the monitoring program that Mark worked on. The bears that crossed the Sabine were overwhelmingly young males, dispersing from established territories in Louisiana in search of unoccupied range on the Texas side. The biology of the situation was consistent with what bear researchers had documented in recovery zones across the country. Females with cubs stay within or near established territories, while young males push the boundaries of the population's range in the exploratory dispersal. That is both how the population expands and how it exports excess males who would otherwise face competition from established boars. The young males that cross the Sabine into East Texas move through the national forest drainages and the private timberland adjacent to the forest, following the creek corridors and the bottomland hardwood belts that provided the cover and the food resources a bear needs. Most of them stayed for a period and then went back across the river. Some of them stayed and found enough food and cover to overwinter. Eventually, as the population density on the Texas side increased enough, females with established ranges on the Louisiana side began producing cubs that dispersed to Texas, and the first documented reproduction on the Texas side of the river followed. Mark ran the camera stations for the bear monitoring program along the drainages north of Newton County throughout the period when the recolonization was establishing itself on the Texas side. He put up hair snares at concentrated food sources, persimmon trees and water oak mast sites and muscadine grape tangles along the creek drainages, and collected hair samples for DNA analysis that allowed the TREEC researchers to identify individual bears by their genetic signatures and track their movements across the monitoring network. He measured bear tracks at camera stations and hair snare locations across years of fieldwork, and the measurements became part of the comparative database he carried in his head alongside the hog survey data and the deer population estimates. Black bear rear foot tracks in East Texas adult males run from 5 to 7 inches in length with the toes spread, in the characteristic plantigrade impression of a bare foot with the full sole visible in soft substrate. The morphology is specific and distinctive. No canid produces a plantigrade impression, and the 5-toed pattern of a bear track is different from the 4-toed pattern of any canid large enough to leave a track of comparable width. When Mark measured the tracks at the US 96 road shoulder the morning after the October 2010 encounter, he was comparing them not to a textbook description of bear tracks or canid tracks, but to the accumulated database of actual tracks he had measured in the field across 15 years of bear monitoring and hog survey work. The morphology of the US 96 tracks was canid, not plantigrade. 4 toes, not 5. Claw tips at the front of each toe not integrated into the toe pad the way a bear claw is integrated, and the stride length was not a comparison that required extended analysis. 49 inches at a walk exceeded the maximum documented stride for any canid in the Texas fauna by a factor that was not in the range of measurement, error, or individual variation. Whatever had left those tracks was not a bear, and was not any canid in the classified Texas species list. The property that Mark and Connie built their life on across the following 2 decades changed significantly across those years, in the way that rural land changes, when the people who own it work it consistently, and with knowledge of what the land is capable of. The failed cattle pasture at the front of the property was converted to a deer food plot within the first 2 years. The food plot program that evolved over the following decade was systematic. Soil testing, in the early years to establish the sandy East Texas soil's pH and nutrient levels, a lime application program to bring the pH into the range that legumes and brassicas prefer, a rotation of lab and iron clay pea in the summer months, when warm season forages provide browse through the period when deer dietary supplements are most valuable, and winter wheat and crimson clover for the fall and late winter, when deer energy needs peak and the natural vegetation provides less. The food plot response was immediate in the first year and cumulative across the following decade as the soil improved and the deer on the property became habituated to the food plot as a reliable resource rather than a novel one. The deer population on the 40 acres and the surrounding neighbor parcels and national forest boundary increased measurably across the first 10 years of the food plot program, which is what happens when a concentrated, high-quality food resource is established in a landscape that was previously managed for timber with no consideration of wildlife habitat. The fencing that came with the original cattle operation was in poor condition when he purchased the property. The wire had been stretched, and the posts were rotted at ground level, in too many places to repair economically, and he removed and replaced it in stages across the first 5 years, putting up a perimeter fence along the county road frontage and the boundary with the adjacent properties to the north and west, cedar posts and woven wire, built to last rather than to look like anything in particular, the working fence of someone who intended to stay on the land a long time. The national forest boundary on the east side of the property is marked by USDA survey monuments sunk into the ground decades ago but carries no fence, and Mark made no effort to fence the east boundary. The national forest timber and the private timber adjacent to the national forest connect to his property on that side without any barrier, and the wildlife movement that uses the eastern portion of his acreage, the creek drainage, and the hardwood mix that runs along the national forest boundary, does not differentiate between his land and the federal land. It is one continuous forest from his driveway to the Sabine River, with the legal boundary invisible on the ground. The camera station on the driveway post was positioned from the beginning to capture the movement corridor that the driveway clearing created through the timber. Mark's professional background had given him a clear understanding of how the creation of a linear clearing through dense forest changes the movement patterns of large mammals in the area. The open strip becomes a travel route, used because it offers the path of least physical resistance through the forest structure, used at night and in the pre-dawn hours by species that are conflict avoidant in their relationship with human activity and prefer the dark hours for their movement. He expected the driveway camera to capture deer and hogs moving through the clearing at night, and it did. He did not expect it to capture what it eventually documented, and the evidence for that documentation accumulated in a bin of SD cards in his basement over 21 years before he understood what it was. The Sabine National Forest that borders his property to the east is relevant to the account, not just as geographic context, but as the larger territorial system within which the corridor crossing his property functions. The National Forest's 160,000 acres of managed pine and bottomland hardwood connect on their eastern edge to the Sabine River bottomland, which connects to the Louisiana forest across the river, making the Sabine National Forest part of a continuous forest ecosystem that extends from Newton County eastward without interruption into the Kisatchie National Forest in central Louisiana and beyond. The territory that uses Mark's corridor has no reason to stop at the Sabine River. The river is a crossing point in a range that may extend significantly farther than the Newton County evidence alone would indicate. Toledo Bend Reservoir, which lies along the Sabine River on the Texas-Louisiana border roughly 20 miles northeast of Mark's property, is the fourth largest reservoir in the United States by surface area and is impounded by the Sabine River between the two states. The reservoir's creation in the 1960s flooded a significant portion of the bottomland hardwood that previously ran along the Sabine in that section of the river, displacing the wildlife that used those bottomlands and concentrating what remained into the surviving bottomland forest between the reservoir's western shoreline and the upland timber. The landscape that funnels along the Sabine National Forest boundary and crosses Newton County toward the river has been shaped by that concentration, with the remaining bottomland drainages carrying heavier wildlife use than they would in an undisturbed landscape, because the reservoir has eliminated much of the alternative bottomland corridor north of the county. The travel route that crosses Mark's property connects to the Sabine River bottomland that runs south of Toledo Bend and north toward the reservoir, and the ecological compression created by the reservoir's impoundment of the Sabine bottomland has made the surviving corridors more critical to the wildlife that uses them. The encounter that would eventually transform the October footage from a single notable event into the second chapter of a 13-year story happened on a night in October of 2010 when Mark was driving south on US 96 after finishing a row of camera station checks in the Sabine National Forest north of Newton. The camera station work was standard mid-season monitoring, pulling SD cards from the deer population survey stations positioned in the National Forest timber units north of the county seat, replacing batteries, clearing brush that had grown up in front of camera fields since the last service visit in late August, adjusting a few angles where the deer had shifted their movement patterns in the interval. He finished the last station in the last light of the afternoon and made the turn onto US 96 southbound through the October dark. The highway runs through the National Forest timberland on a gentle north-south bearing, passing through alternating sections of mature pine on both sides, recently harvested clear-cut units where the slash piles had been burned and the ground was beginning its recovery phase, and the occasional private parcel that sat as a dark cleared rectangle against the forest wall on either side. He had driven this specific stretch of US 96 twice a week for 15 years. He knew every curve and every drainage crossing and every spot where the timber gave way to clear cut and back again. He was driving at 60 miles per hour, with his high beams on, and his attention at the road scanning baseline he maintained during nighttime field driving, peripheral and active, watching for deer crossing at the verge, and hogs working the roadside grass, and the occasional vehicle on the shoulder that meant someone had a flat or was spotlighting deer without a permit. Something crossed from the right shoulder to the left, moving through his headlight beam, and his brain read large mammal before he had consciously resolved the shape. His foot came off the gas. The first specific identification his brain produced was black bear. Large body, dark coat, moving through the beam from right to left, with enough mass and enough deliberateness to rule out deer or hog in the first half second. His professional bear identification reflex was already running. Dark coat, large body, moving from the upland timber toward the road drainage, which was consistent with bear behavior on a road crossing at night, when bears use the road ditches for movement between sections of their range. He was already calibrating size, estimating whether this was an adult boar or a sow with cubs, and reaching for the notebook to log the observation when the shape stopped at the left road shoulder and turned toward. His lights, what turned toward his headlights, was not a bear. The figure was on two legs, not in the posture of a bear that has risen briefly to improve its sight line, with the forelimbs hanging in front of the chest and the weight pitched slightly forward, the posture of an animal borrowing a stance that its frame is not designed for. The figure's weight was over its feet. The torso was upright. The arms hung at its sides in the position that indicates a body that carries its weight on two legs as its default mode of travel, not as an occasional posture adopted for a specific purpose. He ran his calibration against it. The cab height of his truck was known. 5'6" at the roofline above the seat, 6'2" at the top of the cab frame. The figure's head was above the cab roof, at a distance he would later measure as 77 yards. His corrected height estimate was somewhere between 7 feet 10 and 8 feet 2. The shoulders were very wide relative to the waist, with a shoulder-to-waist ratio that was exaggerated beyond anything his experience with large mammals produced in any known species. The arms hung past mid-thigh, with the length that implies a limb built for leverage and reach, rather than for the compact arrangement of a quadruped's forelimb adapted for bipedal use. The legs were heavily built through the upper thigh in the way that indicates something carrying serious body mass on a bipedal frame built for upright travel. Then he focused on the head. His high beams were on, and the night was clear. The distance was 77 yards. He measured it from a reference point on the road shoulder the following morning. The figure's face was turned toward his headlights. The eyes caught the beam and returned amber, not the yellow-green that deer and coyotes and most wild animals produce in headlights, not the orange-red of feral hogs, amber specifically. A warm, distinct color that he had never seen from any large mammal in his 20 years of nighttime fieldwork in East Texas. The eyes held toward his lights without the flinching or the head drop that almost every prey species shows in direct headlight exposure. They held steadily, at a height that was consistent with a face positioned several feet above where a bear's face would be at the same stance. The skull proportions were the part that his brain worked hardest at. The muzzle extended forward from the skull clearly, and at a length that placed it outside every East Texas species his training had equipped him to identify. It was a canine muzzle in its proportions, the forward extension, the width relative to the skull, the angle of the snout, but built to a scale that no documented canid produces. The ears stood at the crown of the skull, erect and angled slightly forward, the pointed shape of a large canid at attention. The overall skull profile, the muzzle and the ear set and the brow line above the amber eyes, was that of a very large dog, rendered at dimensions that are not in any classification system Mark had spent 20 years working with. One specific detail registered before the figure moved. At the base of the throat, where the heavily built neck met the upper chest, and extending several inches down the front of the chest, the fur was lighter than the surrounding coat. The coat across the shoulders and back and down the arms was very dark, a brown-black that registered even in high beams at that distance as essentially uniform dark color. Against that dark coat, the blaze at the throat and upper chest was noticeably lighter, a warm gray or off-white, wide enough at the widest point to be clearly visible as a discrete patch at 77 yards in high beams. A field technician notes individual variation in large mammals automatically, as a learned professional habit. Distinctive markings are what allow you to identify an individual across multiple captures in a camera survey, or to track a specific animal's movements through a study area. Mark registered the chest blaze the way he registered any identifying characteristic in a field observation, in the specific, permanently, cataloged against future reference. 6 seconds, perhaps 7, the figure turned from his lights. It crossed the road shoulder in 2 long strides and entered the pine trees on 2 legs, with the forward lean and the fluid hip-to-hip weight transfer of a biped moving at a walking pace it was designed to sustain. The tree line absorbed it. 4 seconds after it cleared the shoulder, he was looking at nothing but pine shadows and the edge of the road cut in his headlights. He sat with his engine running and his high beams on the tree line. He did not get out of the truck. He ran his professional identification framework against what he had seen. Methodically, the way a field tech runs an identification against a difficult observation. Consider each available category. Test the observation against it. Reject if the match fails. Black bear. The posture failed it. The muzzle profile failed it. The arm proportions failed it. The eye shine color failed it. Person in unusual clothing. The height failed it. The shoulder width failed it. The muzzle profile failed it completely. Equipment distortion. Headlight angle. Distance error. Shadow misread. He had seen the figure in motion, at rest, and in motion again across 6 seconds, at a known distance from a known vantage point, with his high beams providing direct illumination. There was no distortion artifact that could produce a canine muzzle profile at 77 yards in high beams. He sat for close to 15 minutes and did not drive away until the process had run its full course and come back with no result that he could accept. The rest of the drive home was quiet. He told Connie when he got in, laid it out in the same sequence he would use to describe any field observation: location, time, initial identification, the specific details that overrode the initial identification, the physical characteristics that had registered. She listened carefully, She said it was likely a large feral hog standing to scent check the vehicle, which was behavior she had seen documented in hog behavior studies she had read about, and that the distance and the headlight angle had produced a distorted impression of the shape. He did not argue with her. He agreed out loud because the conversation had moved to the point where agreement was easier than continuing, and because he understood that her explanation, wrong as it was the most reasonable explanation she had available. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. The following morning he drove back to the US 96 location before going to work. He parked on the right shoulder at the point from which he had observed the figure and crossed the road to the left side. The left road shoulder in that section is sandy caliche mix. And in October, with the dew that the East Texas nights produce, there was enough surface moisture in the soil between the gravel pieces to hold impressions in the softer areas. He found what he was looking for in the sandy soil at the transition from the road shoulder to the longleaf tree line. The impressions were large. The overall morphology was canid, the oval footprint outline, toe pads forward, the spacing and arrangement consistent with a four-toed canid foot. But the scale was outside any canid. His training had equipped him to measure. He pulled the tape from his coat pocket, 6.5 inches in length at the largest impression, 5 3/4 inches wide. He measured the stride between successive impressions on the same side, 49 inches. For reference, a large male domestic dog, a German Shepherd or a Labrador in the 80 to 90 pound range, walks with a rear foot stride of around 22 to 26 inches. A very large dog, a Mastiff or a Great Dane in the 130 pound range, extends that to perhaps 30 inches at a moderate walk. What Mark was measuring on the US 96 road shoulder was a stride that exceeded the maximum documented stride of any canid at a walking pace by a factor of close to 2. He photographed everything with his work phone, including the tape measure in each frame for scale. He walked the edge of the tree line in both directions from the crossing point, looking for additional sign, and found one more impression in a patch of softer sandy soil, about 30 feet into the pine, consistent with the same individual continuing into the forest, rather than turning or changing direction. He took the photographs. He put the phone in his coat pocket. He wrote up the entry in his field notebook that afternoon at his desk at the department office. One full page and into the second, written with the same systematic precision he applied to any significant wildlife field observation, covering location, time, the US 96 encounter from the previous night in detail, and the road shoulder track measurement from the morning revisit. He filed the notebook on the shelf in the basement office and said nothing to anyone at work. Over the following weeks, he made a quiet, unpublicized pass through his own property cameras, looking for anything he might have missed, going back through the archived footage from the driveway and food plot cameras. The image resolution on the earlier units was not good enough for the kind of detailed identification work that the Moultrie Delta would eventually allow. What he found in the archives were large, dark, indeterminate shapes moving through the driveway at night in the fall months of 2009 and 2010, events he had previously attributed to the local black bear population or to a large feral hog. He started a separate folder on his laptop and filed them there without attributing them to anything, which was the honest professional response. Unidentified motion events, insufficient resolution for species determination, pending better evidence. He thought about the US 96 encounter perhaps twice a week for the first year after it happened. He did not raise it with colleagues. He did not contact any research organization or wildlife agency outside the department. What he did was continue working, running his feral hog surveys, servicing the deer camera stations, monitoring the black bear recolonization corridor along the Sabine, with the one addition of a different quality of attention at the driveway camera on his property, an attention that was looking specifically for the chest marking and the walking posture that the road shoulder encounter had put in his field notebook. The camera hardware on the property improved in stages over the following years. 2012 brought a better digital unit to the driveway post. 2015 added a second camera on the south side of the caliche strip. 2017 replaced both units with the Moultrie Delta configuration that the property runs to this day. One on the post at the tree line end, positioned to cover the gravel from the longleaf tree gap back toward the house, and the Moultrie Delta on the garden side of the house for the area around the blueberry bushes and the food plot edge. The improvement in infrared resolution with each upgrade was substantial, and by 2017, The footage quality was good enough to make individual identification from chest markings and other physical characteristics possible at driveway camera distances. He retired from Texas Parks and Wildlife in 2018, at the end of 23 years of field service. He had not been forced out and was not leaving under any cloud. He was leaving because the consulting work available to an experienced large mammal field technician in East Texas was enough to support the life he and Connie had built on the Newton County property, and because the consulting work let him operate without the institutional overhead. The forms, the reporting chains, the meeting schedules, the interdepartmental coordination requirements that had become increasingly present in the department's field operations as the agency's management culture changed. He picked up several consulting contracts in the months after retirement, a camera survey and population assessment for a hunting lease management company working several large Newton County properties, a feral hog population estimate for a timber company with acreage near the Louisiana border, an informal advisory role for a county agriculture extension office that was trying to understand and document the feral hog pressure on agricultural operations in the area. He was in the field as much as he had been during his department career. He was just no longer writing the results into a form that required a species identification code from an approved list. The years between retirement and the October 2023 footage were years of deep routine on the property, the kind of routine that accumulates into a comprehensive knowledge of a place. He walked every corner of the acreage regularly. He knew where the deer preferred to bed in the Hardwood Creek drainage on the northern end, where the feral hogs used the creek bank for water and wallowing, which approach to the food plot the dominant sow group used consistently. He knew the resident bobcat's circuit through the property well enough to anticipate where it would appear on the camera in any given week. He and Connie had been on this ground for 25 years by the time of the October footage, which is long enough that a place stops being a location you inhabit and becomes the physical texture of your daily life. The uncertain events folder on the computer had grown slowly through those years. Large, dark, indeterminate motion events at the driveway camera, mostly in fall, mostly in the 2 to 4 in the morning window, that he filed without attribution because the resolution question had still not been fully resolved by the earlier camera units. And then, after the Moultrie Delta upgrade in 2017, because the events were infrequent enough and the angles not always optimal enough that the chest marking identification was not always clean in the image. He filed them and moved on. The work on the property demanded his attention across enough dimensions that one folder of uncertain events was not a priority relative to the food plot maintenance schedule and the consulting commitments and the life that Connie and the property between them required him to show up for. In 2018, during the 3 weeks when a young male black bear was active on the property, the camera archive from that fall became ambiguous in a way that the previous years had not been. A large dark shape moving through the driveway in October or November of 2018 could be the bear, or it could be something else. And the Moultrie Delta footage from that period was not always shot at an angle that made the chest region of a dark figure fully readable in infrared. He filed the 2018 events in the uncertain folder and moved on. 2 years later, in the archive review that would follow the October 2023 footage, he would go back through those events with the recognition that the October footage had given him and sort them more carefully. He was not anticipating what the Sunday morning in October of 2023 would produce when he sat down with his coffee and opened the Moultrie on the driveway post. He went through the week's motion events in the usual sequence: the food plot camera first, then the south property camera, then the driveway post camera. The driveway post had captured 6 events for the week, 5 of which he identified within a few seconds each. Deer on 2 separate nights, the resident feral hog family group on Wednesday at 2 in the morning, a coyote on Thursday moving fast through the frame from north to south. The 6th event was a 1:47 in the morning motion trigger from Friday night into Saturday. He opened it expecting the hog family group to have made a second visit. The footage runs for 34 seconds. In the first 4 seconds, as the large figure emerged from the gap in the longleaf at the tree line end of the driveway, Mark had already set down the coffee mug and was watching with the concentrated attention of his field tech years rather than the autopilot of his weekly camera check. By the second time the figure was fully in frame and crossing the caliche toward the camera post, he had brought the tablet close to his face, the way a person brings an image close when they need to see a detail clearly. The figure moved on 2 legs across the gravel with a stride that covered distance efficiently. the torso forward-leaning, the arms swinging in opposition to the leg movement, the overall gait reading as a body built for bipedal travel at pace, rather than for borrowing the posture briefly. The shoulders were very wide. The arms hung past the point where a human's hands fall at the sides. The head sat forward on the shoulders with minimal visible neck, and the infrared image at driveway camera distance showed the muzzle extending forward from the skull line in the canine profile that the US 96 field notebook entry had described. It was carrying something against its chest. The smaller form was held in both arms in a position that kept it pressed against the adult's chest while the adult moved, and it shifted independently as the adult crossed the caliche. A slight weight adjustment, a small limb visible at the edge of the hold, movement that did not originate from the adult's stride, but from a separate living body present within the arms. The adult came to the far edge of the caliche strip near the camera post and stopped. It set down what it was carrying. The small figure was on the gravel. It moved immediately, raised its head and shifted position on the caliche, turning toward the longleaf tree line and then orienting back toward the camera post, a careful examination of its surroundings that implied full alertness and independent awareness. The adult's head swung toward the house, a slow turn that held on the direction of the building for 3 seconds. Then the head swung back toward the longleaf. Then the adult bent and gathered the small figure back against its chest in one smooth motion and straightened and turned toward the pine tree line. It took 4 strides and was behind the longleaf. 12 seconds later, the camera's motion trigger cut out. Mark watched the footage twice before he stood up. He stood at the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the driveway running toward the tree line in the October morning light. Then he sat back down and watched it 3 more times. On the 4th viewing, he was not watching the small figure on the caliche. He was watching the infrared image of the adult figure's upper chest, watching for the pale marking that his field notebook said had been visible in high beams at 77 yards on US 96 in October of 2010. At driveway camera distance in the Moultrie Delta's infrared, the chest marking was visible. The lighter area at the throat and upper chest showed clearly against the dark surrounding coat in the infrared image. The same mark. 13 years. The same individual. He went to the basement office and came back with the 2010 field notebook, open to the entry from the US 96 night. He put the notebook on the kitchen table beside the tablet. He looked at the notebook entry and looked at the footage and looked at the notebook entry again. Connie came downstairs while he was sitting there. She poured her coffee and sat across from him, and he did not say anything before turning the tablet toward her and letting her watch the footage without context. She watched it twice. He put the notebook between them and pointed to the page. She read the entry. She looked at the footage 1 more time. Then she asked him how long he thought it had been out there. He told her he did not know the full answer yet, and that finding it meant going through every card in the bin in the basement. He would spend 3 days on that. Before starting the archive review, he walked to the driveway post. The October morning had been cool overnight, and the soil near the tree line was damp enough to hold impressions. He found them in the sandy soil where the caliche gravel gave way to bare ground between the post and the longleaf. He took out the measuring tape, 6.5 inches in length, 5 3/4 wide, stride between successive impressions, 48 inches. The same measurements he had recorded on the US 96 road shoulder in October of 2010. He photographed everything and went inside to start the archive review. He pulled the SD card bin from the desk in the basement office and set up his laptop with the 2010 notebook open beside it. He started with the most recent Moultrie Delta footage and worked backward year by year. What the archive showed, assembled across 3 days of careful work, was this. In the Moultrie Delta footage from 2017, there were 2 motion events at the driveway post, one in early October and one in late November, where the chest blaze was clearly visible in the infrared image. The figure crossed from east to west in both events, in the same direction and through the same gap in the longleaf at the tree line end of the driveway. Both events occurred between 2 and 3 in the morning. Both showed the same stride pattern and the same arm proportion relative to the body height that the October 2023 footage showed. In 2018, 3 events in the uncertain folder resolved on closer examination as corridor crossings by the same individual. Mark had filed them as uncertain because the black bear active on the property during that period made the large, dark shape category ambiguous. On careful review now, the chest marking was distinguishable in 2 of the 3 events, and in the third, The gait and body proportions were distinct enough from the bear's documented behavior on the cameras to make the attribution confident. In 2019, 2 events. In 2020, 3 events, including the August clip that Mark would return to many times over the following days. In 2021, the March corridor crossing and the fall events, including the August truck examination footage and the November clip that showed the second individual at the tree line. He assembled the documented events chronologically and marked each one on the topographic map he pinned to the basement wall. The entry point and the crossing direction were consistent across all events. The same gap in the long leaf at the southeast end of the driveway, the same west to northwest crossing angle, the same exit at the north end of the property through the hardwood mix adjacent to the national forest boundary. He extended the crossing line on the map in both directions. Southeast, it ran toward the Sabine River bottomland 2 miles from the property. Northwest, it ran through the adjacent private timber parcel and into the southern edge of the Sabine National Forest. Both directions disappeared into continuous forest cover. Neither end of the corridor required crossing a paved road or passing near any lighted structure other than his own property. 7 years of documented corridor crossings, same individual identified by the chest marking in every event, with sufficient resolution to make the identification. Same entry point, same exit. The trail camera on the post at the driveway end had been recording the figure's corridor use. For the full 7 years, the Moultrie Delta had been on the post, and he had been pulling the cards and checking the events and filing the uncertain ones away without looking at them closely enough to understand what he had. The August 2021 event was the one that stayed with him most across those 3 days of archive work. In that clip, the figure did not cross the driveway in its usual continuous line. It stopped at the front of Mark's dark green pickup, which was parked in its usual spot about 20 feet from the camera post. The truck was in the Moultrie's coverage area, in the lower portion of the camera's field at close range, and the infrared image of the figure standing at the truck's front was detailed enough to resolve what its hands looked like where they made contact with the hood near the driver's side headlight. 5 distinct fingers, each digit individually visible in the image. The contact surface was the extended finger pads, not the palm pad surface of a paw. The digit spacing was consistent with an independent grip function, with what appeared to be a directional thumb on one side of the hand that distinguished the grasp from anything in the paw category. Claw tips were visible at the end of each digit, consistent with the overall canid morphology of the figure, integrated into a hand rather than a paw by the independent articulation of the fingers around them. The hand was large in proportion to the truck hood, oversized relative to any human hand in a way consistent with the overall scale of the figure that carried it. The figure stood at the truck for 15 seconds. Then it ran one hand slowly along the hood from the driver's side toward the passenger side. And then it turned and continued in the usual direction toward the north end of the property. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. The truck was in the same condition the following morning. Mark watched that clip 12 times across the 3 days of archive review and thought about it more carefully than he had thought about anything in the archive, except the October 2023 footage itself. A bear encountering a novel object in familiar territory, circles and retreats and returns and circles again, approaching in the multipass exploration pattern of a large mammal processing an unfamiliar detail. The figure in the August 2021 footage had not done that. It had walked directly to the truck, placed its hands on the hood, run one hand along the surface in a slow, focused examination, and continued on the route. That is not the behavior of a large mammal encountering something it has never processed before. It is the behavior of something that knows what trucks are, and is performing a confirmation of a specific detail. The truck it expects to be in this spot is the truck that is actually in this spot, and then continuing with the task it came to accomplish. Mark had driven that truck in and out of the driveway several times a week for years. Whatever used the corridor had crossed the driveway past that truck hundreds of times in the Moultrie Delta footage alone. It knew the truck. The August examination was a check, not an investigation. The juvenile at the tree line in the November 2021 footage was 2 frames of the camera's recording at the far right edge of the field, where the caliche gravel met the longleaf tree line. The adult had crossed and exited the frame. 2 frames later, visible at the gap in the longleaf, where the adult had emerged and where the adult had re-entered the tree line, a second shape was present, smaller than the adult by a significant margin, upright, holding at the boundary between the pine shadow and the caliche clearing, not crossing. The head profile in those two frames showed the canid ear set and the muzzle shape of the adult, built at the proportions of a juvenile. The small figure held at the tree line for those two frames, and then the next motion event showed nothing at that location. 1 year before the October 2023 footage, the juvenile had been present at the edge of this property at the tree line crossing point at least 1 year before the night it was carried across the clearing. This is where part 1 of this account ends. In part 2, we follow Mark into the conclusions the archive drove him toward, into the broader research and cultural context that helped him frame what he had found, and into the changed understanding of his property that has defined his life on it since October of 2023. The question of what the behavioral evidence in the 7-year corridor record implies for the figure's cognitive mapping of the landscape is one that Mark has applied his professional analytical framework to carefully, and the results of that analysis are worth following through in detail, because they point toward conclusions about the nature and the duration of the territorial presence that the physical description of the figure alone does not capture. Territorial mammals maintain cognitive maps of their home ranges, internal representations of the landscape that encode the locations of food resources, water sources, shelter, travel routes, competitor territories, and the position of human infrastructure within the range. The accuracy and the resolution of those cognitive maps vary with the intelligence of the species and the cognitive resources available for spatial representation. Prey species like white-tailed deer maintain ranges of several square miles and move through them with enough precision to find specific bedding sites and feeding locations reliably across seasons. Large predators maintain larger ranges and move through them with more complex route networks. What the Newton County Archive implies about the cognitive map being applied to Mark's property exceeds the complexity of any species in the classified East Texas fauna. The consistency of the entry point across 7 years of documented crossings, the same gap in the longleaf at the southeast end of the driveway, used in every confirmed event, not the adjacent gaps that would produce equivalent or shorter crossings. That specific gap, and no other, implies a retained, specific representation of the property's physical layout at a resolution that distinguishes one tree gap from adjacent tree gaps at the same tree line. Any animal using a route by general navigation, moving toward the open area and crossing at the first available point, would show variability in entry point across years as the vegetation at the tree line changed, and as individual crossings were approached from slightly different angles. The consistency here is not general navigation. It is specific route memory applied to a specific location with the kind of accuracy that distinguishes one point in a tree line from the adjacent points across 7 years of repeated use. The adjusted crossing angles in response to equipment in the clearing are even more informative. Mark's consulting work in the years after retirement regularly brought him to work on his own property. Equipment was parked in varying positions near the driveway camera post, depending on what he was working on in any given week. Across the years of Moultrie Delta footage, the crossing angle used by the figure adjusted in response to what was parked in the clearing. When the camera post area was clear, the crossing ran in a direct line from the entry gap to the exit point at the hardwood stand end. When equipment was present near the camera post, the crossing angle shifted to route around the equipment, while maintaining the most direct available line between entry and exit. The adjustment was applied in real time to each crossing based on the current configuration of the clearing rather than based on a fixed route. That requires pre-crossing observation of the clearing from the entry point before the crossing itself, current state information about what was in the clearing, and on-the-fly routing based on that current state information. The figure was not memorizing a fixed route through the clearing. It was applying a routing algorithm to a known space, using current information about the space's contents to plan each crossing individually. The routing behavior implies that what happened before each of the 14 confirmed crossings was an observation phase from the tree line. The figure approached the longleaf gap, looked at the clearing, assessed the current configuration of obstacles and equipment, planned the crossing route, and then crossed. Mark's cameras were positioned to document the crossing itself, not the pre-crossing observation from behind the tree line. The observation phase is documented by its consequences, the adjusted crossing angles, rather than directly. But the implication is clear. The figure was watching his property from the tree line before crossing it. On all 14 confirmed occasions, and probably on every unconfirmed occasion as well, from a position in the longleaf on the opposite side of the gap where the Moultries field did not reach. Linda Godfrey's analysis of the accounts she collected over 30 years identified the pre-crossing observation behavior as one of the consistent elements of the DOGMAN behavioral signature across multiple geographic regions. Witnesses who encountered the figure at tree lines or woodlot edges frequently described a period in which the figure was visible in or at the edge of the tree line before it crossed into an open area, suggesting that the open area crossings were preceded by assessment periods during which the figure evaluated the space before entering it. The Newton County corridor footage is consistent with this pattern in every particular, and the footage adds something that witness accounts cannot provide: a quantitative record of the crossing angle adjustments that is evidence of the assessment behavior's effectiveness. The figure did not encounter unexpected obstacles in the crossing area on any of the 14 documented events. It routed around obstacles accurately every time. The assessment was working. The Steve Cook DOGMAN account collection produced a geographic analysis that Godfrey's work confirmed. The highest density of documented accounts clustered around specific landscape features, with waterway systems and drainage corridors at the top of the list. The association is not explained by differential reporting rates from riparian versus upland areas. The witnesses who reported upland encounters were as distributed across the landscape as any other category of reporters, and the topographic variation in account density does not correlate with population density, road density, or any other proxy for reporting opportunity. The clustering appears to reflect genuine behavioral preference for specific landscape features: waterways as travel corridors, drainage systems as low-resistance movement routes through dense cover, the edges between dense forest and open terrain as the zones where the figure's movement intersected with human observation. Newton County's landscape has all of these features in concentration. The Sabine River and its tributary drainage network create a dense lattice of bottomland corridors across the county. The longleaf and loblolly uplands alternating with the bottomland hardwood along the drainages produce exactly the edge habitat that the geographic analysis associated with high account concentration. Mark's property is positioned at the edge between two habitat types, its cleared area providing a gap in the forest cover that functions as the open crossing point in an otherwise continuous tree canopy. Every landscape feature that the Cook-Godfrey geographic analysis associated with concentrated encounter activity is present in Newton County, in the specific configuration that makes the corridor use documented in the Newton County archive geographically expected rather than exceptional. If you have spent time in the piney woods of East Texas, in Newton County, Sabine County, anywhere along the Sabine National Forest, or down near the Toledo Bend Reservoir, let me know in the comments if you have had anything you could not explain out there. The institutional silence that ensures the Newton County material stays off the official record is not a local or Texas-specific phenomenon. Mark's phone call to his former colleague at the department confirmed what he already knew from his own career. The reporting architecture defines the observation record, and what does not fit the reporting architecture does not enter the record. But the same structural dynamic operates in every state wildlife agency in the country, because every state wildlife agency was built to manage the species on its management list, and was not built to process evidence of species outside that list. A field technician in Wisconsin who encounters something outside the classification system faces the same reporting pathway, EBSA or absence of reporting pathway, that a field technician in Texas faces. The same form, the same species code requirement, the same institutional culture that treats identifications outside the expected categories as evidence of observer error, rather than as evidence of something outside the categories. The structural architecture of wildlife management in the United States produces, as its aggregate output, an observation record that systematically excludes the evidence that most contradicts the assumptions the record was built to confirm. The East Texas trail camera saturation is the largest unexamined element of the evidence base. Newton County and the surrounding Piney Woods counties have among the highest camera per acre ratios of any comparable area in North America, driven by the deer hunting culture and the management practices of the timber company lands. The aggregate database of nighttime motion events captured on those cameras across the county at any given time is in the millions of frames per year. The overwhelming majority of that database is reviewed by landowners looking for deer and hog activity, and filed or discarded when those reviews are complete. The small fraction of the database that captures large, dark, upright figures moving through the 2 to 4 in the morning window. The fraction that looks, at first review, like an ambiguous hog or a possible bear, or an indeterminate large shape at the far edge of the camera's infrared range, goes into uncertain folders on laptops in home offices across the county, and sits there, filed and not reviewed closely, while the landowners who captured it continue pulling cards and checking for deer on Sunday mornings. The Newton County Archive is one data set in what is effectively a distributed, uncoordinated, multi-decade monitoring program running across the East Texas piney woods that no one has designed or is analyzing. The patterns visible in one man's 21 years of property cameras are presumably visible at different scales and with different levels of documentation quality across hundreds of properties in the same landscape. The decision that Mark and Connie have made about their footage, keeping it on an encrypted drive, redirecting the driveway camera, maintaining the corridor as a corridor, is a decision that does not make the situation less real or the population less present in the landscape. It is a decision about the appropriate relationship between the specific people who have this specific information and the situation that produced it. Other people with other information about other corridors on other properties in Newton County and the surrounding counties are making their own decisions, or not making decisions at all, filing the uncertain events in folders and moving on. The aggregate result is that the East Texas piney woods continues to be what it has always been. A landscape occupied by more than the classification system acknowledges, documented only by the people who are paying close enough attention to see past the most convenient explanation for what is in their camera footage. Mark pays that kind of attention. He has paid it for 40 years, by training and by professional habit, and by the particular disposition of a person whose entire working life was built on the principle that accurate observation of what is actually present in the landscape is the foundation of everything that follows. The October 2023 footage showed him what is actually present at the edge of his property. The archive showed him how long it has been there. The February afternoon at the creek drainage showed him that the relationship runs in both directions. He knows what he knows. He is living accordingly. The archive review that consumed 3 days of Mark's time in late October of 2023 was the most methodical investigative work he had done since the Black Bear Recolonization Monitoring Program in the late 90s. He approached it the same way he would approach any systematic wildlife survey. Establish a standardized identification criterion, apply it consistently across the dataset, and let the results build the picture without shaping the picture before the results were in. His identification criterion was the chest marking, the pale blaze at the throat and upper chest visible in the US 96 field notebook entry from 2010, visible in the October 2023 footage, and visible in the infrared image at driveway camera distance whenever the Moultrie Delta's angle and the figure's orientation made the chest region readable. He did not count events he could not confirm by the chest marking. He pulled the cards year by year and reviewed every motion event at the driveway post camera from 2017 forward, with the specific criterion applied to every frame where a large, dark figure appeared. The 2017 results: 2 events, one in October and one in late November. In the October event, the figure crossed from the Longleaf Gap east to west across the Caliche in 9 strides, at a pace that his experience with wildlife footage told him was a comfortable walking speed for the size of the figure. The chest marking was visible in the mid-crossing frames where the Moultrie's angle gave a partial frontal view. In the November event, the figure crossed west to east, the reverse direction, at a slightly different crossing angle, higher up the Caliche strip than the October crossing, clearing the far end of the camera's coverage area in 7 strides. The chest marking was again visible in the frames where the figure's chest was oriented toward the camera. Both events fell between 2:15 and 3 in the morning. The 2018 cards required more careful work because of the black bear. The bear had come to the property in early October and been documented on the Salt Lick camera and the food plot camera over a period of about 3 weeks before disappearing south toward the National Forest bottomland. During the 3-week overlap period, the driveway camera captured 4 motion events involving large, dark shapes moving through the Caliche strip in the 2 to 4 in the morning window. Mark had filed all 4 in the uncertain folder. Going through them now with the chest marking as his criterion, 2 of the 4 showed the chest marking clearly in the readable frames and were attributable with confidence. The third was an ambiguous angle. The figure was crossing parallel to the camera's line of sight, showing mostly the back and the profile, and the chest region was not visible. The fourth event was the bear, identifiable by the plantigrade gait and the absence of any upright bipedal stride in any of the frames. The 2019 cards produced 2 confirmed crossings, one in February and one in October. The February crossing moved west to east, consistent with the late winter directional pattern. The October crossing moved east to west, consistent with the fall pattern. Each event was in the 2 to 3 in the morning window. Each showed the chest marking in the readable frames. 2020. 3 confirmed crossings in January, October, and August. The January crossing was a late winter event. The October crossing was a fall event. The August crossing was the one that required him to stop and watch the clip more than once before moving on. The figure had paused briefly near the camera post on its crossing, within 30 feet of the Moultrie, and the Moultrie Delta's infrared at 30 feet produced a level of detail in the pause frames that the longer distance crossing frames did not produce. The chest marking was fully visible. The shoulder proportions and the arm length and the canid muzzle profile were all clearly resolved. He photographed the screen with his phone and added the still images to the folder he had started creating for the archive review documentation. 2021. The March corridor crossing, the August truck examination, and the November frames, showing the juvenile at the tree line. He had already reviewed all 3 in detail. He wrote the confirmed crossings in the notebook by month and year, and continued to 2022. 2022. 2 corridor crossings, in February and October. The February crossing was west to east, consistent with the late winter pattern. The October crossing was east to west, consistent with fall. In the October crossing, the juvenile was not visible at the tree line. The 2-frame appearance of the smaller figure had been in November of 2021, a year earlier. The October 2022 crossing was a single adult crossing. The same chest marking, the same entry gap, the same stride pattern, indistinguishable in any specific from the October 2017 crossing, except for the improved Moultrie Delta image quality relative to the earlier events. Then 2023. The October 26th footage that had started the review. He wrote out the complete list in his notebook. 12 confirmed crossings over 7 years of Moultrie Delta footage, plus 2 events in 2022 and 2023 that he could not confirm by the chest marking but that fell within the same timing window and used the same entry and exit corridor, and were probably the same individual at angles that did not resolve the chest region clearly enough for confident confirmation. 14 events in 7 years. An average of 2 confirmed crossings per year, with additional probable crossings that the camera angle did not document definitively. The corridor was not being used continuously. It was being used consistently, with a seasonal pattern that implied purposeful movement between sections of a defined range, rather than random traversal of available territory. He pinned the topographic map to the basement wall, the same series of standard USGS topographic series he had used for fieldwork throughout his career. He marked each documented crossing point with the date and the direction of travel, using different colored pins for fall crossings and late winter crossings. The fall pins clustered in the east to west direction. The late winter pins clustered in the west to east direction. He extended the crossing line on the topo in both directions, using a pencil and a ruler. Southeast from the longleaf tree line at the driveway end of the property. The line ran 2 miles toward the Sabine River bottomland, through private timberland, and then into the National Forest bottomland, adjacent to the river. Northwest from the hardwood stand at the north end of the property, the line ran through the adjacent timber parcel and into the interior of the Sabine National Forest, at a bearing that took it toward a ridge system in the National Forest that carried mature upland oak and pine. Exactly the simple, kind of mast-producing upland habitat that would be a Kunside, high-priority fall destination for a large mammal shifting into the acorn drop period. The corridor made ecological sense as a connection between 2 high-value habitat sections. Sabine River bottomland water and cover on the southeast end, upland mast on the northwest end, with Mark's property as the open crossing point in the middle. He stood at the map for a long time. He looked at his property in the center of the topo, the house symbol on the ridge, the driveway line running southeast from the house to the county road, and the crossing line he had drawn running northwest to southeast across the property 40 yards below the house symbol. The corridor had been there the entire time. Every year of food plot work, every year of camera service, every Sunday morning of checking the cards with coffee at the kitchen table, the corridor had been there, and the figure had been using it, and he had been living 40 yards from it without knowing what the driveway camera was seeing. The behavioral analysis of what the assembled archive showed is where Mark's professional background gave him tools that most witnesses to this kind of event do not have available. He has been reading large mammal behavior in the field for 40 years. He knows what consistent corridor use at a specific crossing point implies about the cognitive map an animal is carrying. He knows what the truck examination behavior implies about prior observation. He knows what the juvenile at the tree line in November 2021 implies about when the family unit began using this territory and what the adult was teaching the juvenile about the crossing protocol. He could apply his professional analytical framework to the footage and the archive in ways that a person without his background would not know to do. What that analysis produced, applied to the 14 confirmed crossing events and the behavioral details of the truck examination and the juvenile footage, was a picture of a territorial large mammal managing a range with a high degree of spatial memory, route consistency, and awareness of human infrastructure within the range. The same entry point used across 7 years, the same crossing angle, with adjustments for specific obstacles in the clearing that implied pre-crossing observation from the tree line before each event. The confirmation behavior at the truck, which implied a cognitive model of the property detailed enough to register the truck as an expected feature of the clearing rather than a novel object. The juvenile held at the tree line in the adult's first passage, and then apparently introduced to the crossing in the following year, which implied a period of observation before crossing that the adult was modeling for the juvenile before allowing it to enter the open area. The duration is the aspect that the behavioral analysis keeps returning to, an individual maintaining a travel route with that level of consistency for 7 documented years. With evidence of corridor use before the Moultrie Delta's resolution was sufficient to confirm the chest marking, which means the pre-documentation period extends at least to 2002 when the first cameras went on the property, and possibly much earlier, is not passing through. It is managing a range that has incorporated this specific piece of ground as a feature. The range predates the property's development. It predates, in all likelihood, the county's designation. The caliche driveway was built across a route that was already in use. The house was built 40 yards from a corridor that the territory's occupant had been using before the house existed. The question of what the October footage means against the background of the full archive is ultimately the question of duration, not what did Mark's Moultrie camera capture on a Friday night in October of 2023. That question has a clear answer. The question is, how long has this piece of Newton County ground been part of a territorial range that the wildlife classification system has no category for? And the answer the archive provides is longer than any camera system has been on the property to document it. The 2010 field notebook entry establishes a prior encounter that predates the Moultrie Delta's footage by 7 years. The uncertain events in the pre-Moultrie camera footage extend the probably consistent corridor use back to at least 2002, and the Alabama Coushatta oral traditions, the Big Thicket historical accounts, and the 1887 Wexford County lumberjack record establish that whatever is using the Newton County corridor is part of a population that has been occupying the specific types of forested landscape of the piney woods, represent for a span of time that the scientific record does not acknowledge because the scientific record was never structured to acknowledge it. Mark is 58 years old. He and Connie expect to live on the Newton County property for the rest of their lives. The property will eventually pass to the next generation of their family, and whatever they communicate to that generation about the nature of the ground, the creek drainage, and the upland timber, and the caliche driveway, and the corridor that crosses it 40 yards below the house, will shape how the next generation manages the relationship. He intends to tell them what the archive showed. He intends to leave the encrypted drive in the basement office, with a document explaining what the files contain, and what the topographic map on the wall shows, and what the appropriate relationship to the corridor crossing has been for the past 27 years, and should continue to be good neighbors, deliberately, from here on. The 40 acres at the edge of the Sabine National Forest in Newton County, Texas, are one piece of a larger landscape that has been occupied in ways that the legal description of the property does not capture, managed in ways that the county deed record does not reflect, and known at a level of detail that the survey monuments do not mark. The family in the house on the ridge knows what has been using the corridor and has decided how to respond to that knowledge. The corridor continues. Mark sat in the basement office after assembling the full archive chronology with the topographic map on the wall and the SD card bin on the desk, and the column of dated motion events in his notebook running from 2017 to 2023. He sat there for a while without doing anything. He had lived on this property for 27 years. He had walked every corner of the acreage regularly. He had run cameras on the property since 2002 and checked the current cards every Sunday morning for 21 years without missing a week, and for at least 7 of those years, the figure identified in the October footage had been crossing his driveway between 2 and 3 in the morning while he and Connie slept in the house 40 yards from the camera post, multiple times per year, in a seasonal pattern with enough regularity that the directional bias of the crossings was visible when he laid the events out chronologically. A cluster in the fall months moving east to west, from the Longleaf Gap toward the National Forest interior, and a smaller cluster in late winter moving west to east, from the National Forest side back toward the Sabine River bottomland. Same individual identified by the chest marking in every event, with sufficient infrared resolution to make the identification. Same entry point, same crossing angle, same exit corridor, across 7 documented years. 7 years of crossings through his property, on a route that was 40 yards from his house, and the only record of it was in a bin of SD cards he had been cycling through on autopilot without understanding what was in them. The seasonal corridor pattern was the aspect of the assembled archive that Mark, with his fieldwork background, found most significant as evidence of a range structure rather than opportunistic wandering. The fall crossings running east to west toward the National Forest interior corresponded with the acorn mass drop period, when the upland oak and pine timber in the Sabine National Forest provided high caloric food resources, pulling large mammal activity toward the interior. The late winter V crossings, reversing west to east toward the Sabine River bottomland, corresponded with the period when the bottomland drainages provided the most reliable water and thermal cover after the upland sites had dried and cooled. A large mammal with a range spanning both habitat types would move seasonally in exactly that pattern, following the resource gradient as the seasons changed it. The cross-property corridor was the gap between 2 sections of its range, used twice per year on the seasonal transition and additional times at intervals throughout the year, when the corridor was a convenient route between points within the range. The figure was not passing through Newton County. It was living in it. The behavioral analysis of the truck footage from August 2021 told Mark what kind of intelligence was managing that territorial range. When a bear encounters a novel object in familiar territory, something changed, something moved, something new placed where nothing was before. It processes the novel object through the multi-pass exploratory protocol that large mammals use for unfamiliar stimuli. Approach to threshold distance, retreat. Approach from another angle, contact, assess, integrate. That is the protocol of a cognitive system managing uncertainty about an unfamiliar input. The figure in the August 2021 footage had not done any of that. It had walked directly to the truck, placed both hands on the hood, run one hand along the surface in a single slow pass, and continued the corridor crossing. That is the protocol of something that already knew what the truck was, that had been observing it from the tree line for long enough to have fully incorporated it into its model of the property, and that was performing a confirmation check of a specific expected detail. The truck that belongs in this spot is in this spot. Before proceeding, the cognitive operation that produces that behavior is not processing novelty. It is verifying familiarity. The implications of that distinction for what the figure knew about Mark's property before any of the camera events were captured are not subtle. It had been watching the property from the tree line on each crossing, checking the clearing before using it, updating its model of the property against the current state of the physical space. It had noted the truck, cataloged its position as an expected feature of the clearing, and continued monitoring the position across however many crossings preceded the August 2021 examination. How many of those preceding crossings fell before the Moultrie Delta went on the post in 2017? And how many fell before the earlier digital cameras went on the driveway in 2012? And how many fell before the film cameras went on the property in 2002? Those are questions the archive cannot answer. The cross-referencing of the 2010 field notebook description against the archive's first clean identification in 2017 implies that the figure was using the corridor before the cameras were capable of documenting it clearly. Whether the corridor use predates the property's development under Mark and Connie, whether it predates the house, the food plot, the caliche driveway itself, is a question the archive answers with silence. If you have spent time in the piney woods of East Texas, in Newton County, Sabine County, anywhere along the Sabine National Forest, or down near the Toledo Bend Reservoir, let me know in the comments if you have had anything you could not explain out there. Because what the documented record from this property shows is that the activity in that part of the piney woods goes back considerably further than any camera record can reach. Linda Godfrey spent 30 years assembling the behavioral documentation that gives the Newton County Archive its broader context. Godfrey began with the Bray Road accounts from Elkhorn, Wisconsin, in 1991, a series of independent witnesses reporting a large, upright canine figure on a rural road in Walworth County over several months. She was a journalist, not a researcher with a prior investment in the phenomenon's reality, and she approached the accounts with the discipline of someone whose professional obligation was to verify rather than to confirm. What she found when she went through multiple independent witnesses who had no contact with each other before she interviewed them was a physical description and a behavioral profile that were consistent at a level of detail that shared influence could not explain. The same muzzle profile, the same amber or warm yellow eye shine, the same arm length past mid-thigh, the same capacity for bipedal travel at an extended walking pace and quadrupedal travel at speed, the same territorial behavior that communicated rather than attacked, the same consistent association with waterway systems, bottomland drainages, and forested travel corridors. She spent the following 3 decades collecting accounts from witnesses across Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Appalachia, and the Gulf Coast states. The witnesses shared no common cultural source for their descriptions. They were interviewed independently. Their accounts were not published in a form that allowed later witnesses to model their reports on earlier ones before coming forward. And across 30 years and hundreds of accounts, the behavioral profile remained consistent in every particular: nocturnal, territorial, associated with waterways and drainage corridors, aware of human infrastructure and human routine in ways that implied long-term observation of the same properties over extended periods, capable of restraint when confrontation was within its capacity, and present in the accounts of people who had no institutional reason to report what they had seen and every social reason not to. The behavioral signature in 7 years of Newton County Moultrie Delta footage, the consistent corridor use, the truck examination, the adjusted crossing angles in response to changed equipment positions in the clearing, the juvenile held at the tree line in November 2021, while the adult crossed ahead of it, and the carrying event in October 2023, matches every element of the Godfrey profile. In every specific, the profile was assembled from hundreds of independent accounts across multiple geographic regions and multiple decades. The Newton County footage was not informed by those accounts. Mark had not read Godfrey's documentation work before the October Sunday morning. He had not been following the DOGMAN research community. He was a working wildlife field technician whose observational interest was in the documented species list of East Texas, and what the Moultrie captured on his property was outside that list. The match between the Newton County behavioral record and the Godfrey profile is not confirmation bias. It is independent correspondence. Steve Cook's 1987 radio broadcast in northern Michigan is the document that gave the phenomenon its first substantial contemporary record in the post-folklore period, and it did so accidentally in a way that illuminates how much of the phenomenon's documented history depends on the existence of a platform that allows people to report experiences they have been carrying in silence. Cook was a disc jockey at WTCM in Traverse City. He wrote a song called The Legend as an April Fool's broadcast, drawing on a historical account from 1887. 2 lumberjacks working the logging camps along the Manistee River in Wexford County reported encountering a figure with the body of a man and the head of a dog in the timber near their camp. Cook treated the account as regional color for what he believed was fabricated mythology. The broadcast aired, and the phones came in with something other than laughter. People who had been carrying encounters for years, in some cases for decades, who heard the song and understood for the first time that there was a category for what they had experienced. Not a scientific category, not an institutional category, but a category. And who called the station to describe what they had seen? Cook spent the following 30 years collecting those accounts. By the time the Newton County footage was captured, the accumulated record from Cook and Godfrey and a small number of other systematic collectors ran to several thousand accounts from across the continent, none of them citing each other as sources, all sharing the same figure and the same behavioral profile in the same kinds of terrain. The 1887 Wexford County account deserves attention for what it represents about duration. 1887 is close to 140 years ago. The Manistee River country in Wexford County in that period was primary forest being logged for the first time by the commercial timber operations that would transform the Great Lakes region across the following 3 decades. The men working those camps were in timber that had not been commercially touched before, on drainages that had never had a permanent human presence in the modern sense. What they described in that primary forest in 1887 is what Mark documented on the edge of the Sabine National Forest in 2023. The same figure, the same physical description, the same behavioral signature of a territorial presence occupying a specific section of forested land. 140 years between those two accounts is not a gap in the record. It is the period during which the record was not being kept, because no one with a platform capable of collecting it was asking the question. East Texas has its own pre-documentation record, and it is older than most people who engage with this phenomenon have had access to. The Big Thicket Ecosystem, the remarkable biologically diverse bottomland forest in Hardin, Tyler, Jasper, and Polk counties to the west of Newton County, carries documented accounts of large upright figures in the forest going back into the 1900s, and with earlier anecdotal roots extending into the period before the place, Civil War. These accounts did not appear in cryptid literature, which did not exist in its modern form before the mid-20th century. They appeared in East Texas newspaper accounts, hunters' journals, and the oral records of the families that worked the Big Thicket, timber, and turpentine operations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The figures described were called wild men in those accounts because wild man was the available category. The physical descriptions, large, dark-coated, upright, associated with the dense bottomland creek corridors, are consistent across the decades of East Texas accounts, and consistent with what Cook's northern Michigan listeners described and what the Newton County Moultrie Delta documented. The Big Thicket record predates any cross-regional communication about the phenomenon by a century or more. It is not a product of shared legend. It is a product of people in a specific landscape reporting what they encountered in it. Newton County is east of the Big Thicket proper, in the Sabine National Forest territory, but the forest ecosystem is continuous between them. The bottomland hardwood drainages and the upland pine stands run without major interruption from the Big Thicket counties, east through Jasper and Sabine counties to the Sabine River, and the territory that uses Mark's corridor does not recognize the management designations that divide that landscape into National Preserve units and National Forest units and private timber company parcels. Whatever occupied the Big Thicket, drainages in the 1890s occupies the same continuous forest in 2023. The Sabine National Forest is the eastern extension of that landscape, not a separate ecosystem. The Alabama Coushatta tribe of Texas, whose reservation is in Polk County approximately 60 miles west of Mark's property, holds traditional and documented cultural knowledge of the East Texas forest that predates European contact by many centuries. The Alabama Coushatta are Muskegean-speaking peoples whose cultural relationship with the piney woods ecosystem is rooted in a span of time that makes everything the European-derived scientific and governmental institutions have done with the landscape in the past 200 years look like a recent overlay. Their oral traditions reference beings associated with specific territories in the piney woods that are recognized not as supernatural presences outside the natural order, but as natural presences within it, things that have occupied certain sections of the forest for longer than the Alabama Coushatta themselves have lived in East Texas, that are aware of human activity within their range, and that communicate territorial boundaries through calibrated behavior rather than harm. Those traditions are not shared in their specifics with outside researchers, and that refusal is neither obstruction nor hostility. It is the reasonable protective stance of a community that has watched outside attention bring disruption to things it holds responsible relationships with, and it is consistent with the understanding that some knowledge belongs to the relationship between a people and a place, rather than to external inquiry. What the Alabama Coushatta traditions do acknowledge, in the form available to anyone outside the tribal community, is that the deep East Texas piney woods contain presences that the European-derived classification system does not account for, that the Alabama Coushatta and their ancestors have known this across a span of time, not comparable to any period of European engagement with the landscape, and that the appropriate relationship to those presences is one of recognition and respect, rather than extraction or investigation. The territory that was designated Newton County in 1846, that was parceled into national forest units and private timber holdings across the following century, was occupied when those designations were applied. The occupancy continues. Texas Parks and Wildlife does not have a reporting category for what the Newton County Archive documents. Mark made one phone call to a former colleague in the department in November, 6 weeks after the October footage. A wildlife biologist who had managed the East Texas Black Bear Monitoring Program, a person he trusted and whose scientific judgment he respected. He framed the question as hypothetical. What happens when a field person submits camera evidence that does not match any documented species on the approved list? The biologist said that ambiguous footage always got attributed to a known species in an unusual posture or unusual lighting condition, because the submission form required a species designation, and someone reviewing the submission had to put something in the field. The department, he said, was not structured to investigate observations outside its management mandate, and the practical result was that credible evidence outside those categories did not get pursued. He said this matter-of-factly, in the tone of someone describing a structural constraint they have accepted as a feature of the system they work within. The mechanism was familiar to Mark from his own career. The field technician whose track measurements from a survey unit in Sabine County came in outside the standard size range and were attributed to recording error in the final data set, because opening the question the data implied was outside the program's design. The warden who filed a report on sign that matched nothing on the management list, and whose standing in the regional office diminished in the months following the report, without anyone connecting the diminishment to the report in any explicit way. The informal understanding that field people absorb early in institutional careers. Identifications outside the expected categories are a professional liability, because the system was built to produce results within its categories, and evidence that does not fit those categories has no pathway to institutional action. The reporting architecture defines the limits of what is officially observed, and what does not fit the architecture does not enter the record. This is not suppression in the active sense. No one is making decisions to hide evidence they know exists. The structural outcome, evidence outside the categories is filed and not pursued, is produced by the ordinary operation of a classification system applied to a world larger than the system's categories. The ethical weight of the October footage is the aspect of the discovery that Mark has thought about most carefully across the months since it was captured, and the center of that weight is the juvenile. The October footage plus the archived juvenile at the tree line is evidence of a family group. An adult that has been using the Newton County corridor as a travel route for at least 7 documented years, and a young one that has been in the territory for at least 1 year before the October footage, being carried through the crossing at 1:47 in the morning in late October. The calculation about what the footage becoming publicly known would bring to the Sabine National Forest boundary is not abstract. People would come to Newton County. Most of them would come with trail cameras and hope, and the genuine wish to document something the scientific establishment has not yet acknowledged. Some would come with firearms, and the belief that a collected specimen settles the question in a way that a camera image cannot. The juvenile in the October footage is alive and growing up in a territory that, as long as the location of the corridor remains known only to Mark and Connie, faces no human pressure beyond what it has absorbed across at least 7 documented years. Making the location widely known changes that. Mark has decided he is not willing to accept the changed calculation. He and Connie discussed selling the property once, briefly, in the 2 weeks after the October footage, when the full scope of what the archive had shown was still settling into his understanding of the ground they lived on. The conversation was short. 27 years on this land, the property known at the level that 27 years of careful attention produces, a level that does not transfer to new ground regardless of the quality of the new ground. Whatever used the corridor had been sharing the property with them across 7 documented years without causing harm. The restraint in the record was complete and consistent. They decided to stay. They have not reconsidered. He moved the Moultrie from the driveway post to the garden side of the house in November, redirecting the camera away from the corridor crossing point. He has not placed any camera at the driveway end of the property since. The corridor is still being used. He does not know the frequency because he is no longer documenting it, and he has decided that not documenting it is the appropriate response to what the archive showed. The footage that exists is on an encrypted drive in the basement office. It is not going to any research organization. It is not going to media. It is going to stay there. One more event happened in the months following the October footage, and Mark included it because leaving it out would be dishonest about the nature of the relationship between his property and what lives behind it. In February of the following year, he was checking the creek drainage on the south end of the property for feral hog sign. The walk was routine. He checked that drainage every few weeks throughout the year, reading the bank for rooting and wallow evidence and the track patterns that told him where the hog pressure was concentrated. The February afternoon was the East Texas winter variety that never fully gets cold. 50 degrees and overcast, the light flat and gray, the bottomland hardwood understory bare enough through November and December that the topography was readable in ways the summer foliage never permits. He was 2/3 of the way through the drainage check, moving slowly because the hog sign was heavy in that section, when something his peripheral awareness had registered redirected his attention toward the northwest portion of the property without his having consciously decided to look there. It is a specific quality of shift that field people learn to recognize. The moment when the background processing of experienced observation redirects itself toward a point in the landscape before the conscious attention has named what it has found. He stopped and looked toward the northwest edge of the property, toward the hardwood stand at the property boundary in that direction. At the edge of the hardwood stand, approximately 90 to 100 yards away, something was in the shadow between 2 large water oaks, upright, still, partially screened by the bare winter understory, visible because the understory was open enough in February that the shape between the 2 trees was distinct against the gray sky behind the stand. He looked at it directly. It held its position. He looked at it for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. He checked his watch afterward, because since the October footage, he had been in the habit of noting time when anything unusual occurred on the property. 2 minutes and 40 seconds of direct, mutual attention across 100 yards of dormant winter bottomland. Then he looked back at the creek bank and resumed checking for hog sign. When he looked again 5 minutes later, the space between the water oaks was empty. He told Connie that evening. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said she thought it had been something like a check-in, the property's occupant verifying that the arrangement between them was still in place, that the camera was still off the driveway post, that the family at the house was still conducting itself the way it had been. He said he thought she might be right, though he was careful to note that interpretation was what they had available and not what the evidence showed. She said sometimes interpretation is the only tool left, and you use what you have. Newton County, Texas in October, is a specific kind of place. The longleaf pine drops its needle cast across the forest floor, and the ground goes rust orange for a few weeks. The creek bottoms open as the bottomland understory dies back through November, and for a month or so you can see 60 yards into the hardwood drainages that are impenetrable walls of green through the rest of the year. The deer are in rut. The hogs are in the acorn drop, working the upland timber through the night. The coyotes run the property lines and call back and forth in exchanges that carry a quarter mile on a still night. It is the season when the piney woods show you their structure, when the terrain the summer conceals becomes readable, when the full scale of the forest becomes clear in ways the crowded summer canopy does not permit. And somewhere in the longleaf and bottomland hardwood of Newton County, in the territory that borders Mark's property to the north and east and extends without interruption into the Sabine National Forest, and across the Sabine River toward Louisiana, there is a range that has been occupied for a span of time that no Newton County deed record acknowledges. The caliche driveway that crosses it is a detail of that range, the widest open section of the travel route, the path of least resistance through the timber strip between 2 sections of the territory. And it has been treated as a detail of the route for at least 7 documented years, and almost certainly for considerably longer than that. The house 40 yards from the driveway post has been noted and categorized and left alone. The truck near the camera post has been examined and confirmed and passed. The family that sleeps in the house has been watched from the Water Oak stand in the February afternoon light and determined to fall within whatever category the occupant of the range assigns to the human presence at the edge of its territory. The juvenile is in that forest. Whatever age it is now, it has had another year since the October footage to grow into the territory the adult has been working for at least 13 years. It knows the drainage patterns and the upland ridges and the location of the house at the edge of the caliche. It knows the crossing and the gap in the longleaf and the truck that parks near the camera post. It knows this land at the level of detail that comes from moving through it in the dark across multiple seasons. The level that cannot be acquired from any map, but only from the ground itself, walked until it is carried without thinking about it. It will carry that knowledge for the full length of its life. It will be here long after the house and the driveway and the camera post are gone, and the longleaf has reclaimed the cleared area, and the creek drainage has shifted its channel through the property, the way creek drainages shift their channels over the decades. The 40 acres that Mark bought as a timber investment and a hunting property and eventually a home have always been 40 acres at the edge of something larger. He knew the national forest was there. He knew the river was there. He knew the wildlife that moved through both used his property as part of its range. What he did not know was the full character and the full duration of the specific relationship between his property and the territory it borders. Now he does, and the knowledge, absorbed into the daily rhythm of a life on a piece of ground that is familiar in its topography and its seasons and its wildlife and its domestic rhythms after 27 years, has not made the ground unfamiliar. It has made it more fully known. The adult set its young down on the caliche at 1:47 in the morning in October. It looked toward the house for 3 seconds. It picked its young back up and turned toward the longleaf pines. It took 4 strides and was behind the tree line, and the Moultrie camera recorded 12 more seconds of empty gravel before the motion trigger cut out. They were good neighbors by accident for 27 years. They will be good neighbors deliberately from here on. That is all that is owed. That is all that has been asked for. The piney woods do not give up what they hold. The East Texas forest has absorbed generations of human presence. The timber companies and the hunting camps and the county roads and the family holdings passed through multiple generations without subdivision, and what the forest holds beneath and behind all of that human presence has absorbed all of it in turn, accommodating the overlay of human use without being defined by it or reduced to it. The longleaf and the loblolly and the bottomland water oak and the Sabine River and the tributary drainages that feed it were here before the county existed. They will be here after the county's institutional architecture has changed beyond recognition. Whatever uses the corridor across Mark's caliche driveway 40 yards below his house on a ridge in Newton County, Texas has been here across all of that time and will be here across whatever follows it. The October footage is 34 seconds of documentation in a relationship that has no beginning in any record Mark can reach and no foreseeable end in any record he will live to see. He checked his cameras on a Sunday morning and found out that the forest behind his house is occupied in ways he had not known, that it has been occupied that way for as long as he has lived on the property, and almost certainly for as long as the property has existed in its current form. He is going to leave the camera off the driveway post. He is going to continue checking the cards on Sunday mornings with his coffee. He is going to walk his property with the specific awareness that the boundary between his land and the national forest is a legal line that does not mean what he thought it meant for 27 years. And that is enough. That is exactly enough. Mark has spent 40 years as a professional observer of large mammals in the East Texas piney woods. The professional identity, that career, built, accurate, calibrated, not given to interpretation beyond what the evidence supports, is the same identity that he applied to the Sunday morning footage and the 3 days of archive review and the February afternoon at the creek drainage. He is not a person who assigns experience to categories before the evidence supports the assignment. He is a person who lets the evidence build the category. And the evidence in this case has built a category that the classification system does not contain. He is living at the edge of territory that the classification system does not acknowledge. 40 yards from a corridor that something has been using since before he built the house on the ridge, and he has decided that the appropriate response to this knowledge is to be a good neighbor. He does not know what the figure makes of the family in the house. He knows what the family in the house makes of the figure in the forest. That is the part of the relationship he can manage, and he is managing it.